Wayne Wong has just received his PhD in the study of film studies, martial arts film and it was a joint PhD supervision across London and Hong Kong universities. Wayne, how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing great. Thanks, Paul.
Excellent. So you're in Hong Kong at the moment?
Yes, I'm currently in Hong Kong. I'm working at Hong Kong Polytechnic University as a full-time teacher there.
Excellent. And you have kind of been with us from the start, haven't you? You came to more or less every conference, and so that must have been right at the start of your PhD studies, right? When you came to the first conference.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes, it was a memorable experience. So it was my first time going to England, actually. So actually not England, but
yeah.
Wales as well. Yeah, so it's my first time going there. So I was so impressed with the scale of the conference and also the scholars. Everything was so perfect. So that's why I decided to come, as many times as possible.
Yeah. So how did you manage to be doing a PhD in Hong Kong and London? How did that work? What was the situation there?
Hmm. That's a very good question because this just joint franchise is not quite common in academia. But I find it very fruitful because for a students who want to work with martial arts cinema, I want to see from a different perspective, especially because my thesis deal with martial art learning. So I want to compare, how practitioners learn in Hong Kong and also how they learn martial arts in the UK where I based was in London. So I find it very interesting to compare the two approaches and find, similarity and differences.
Okay, so you
Yes.
you are a practicing martial artist, and so you studied, you went to different clubs in the UK and in Hong Kong, and kind of
Mm,
thought about the teaching and learning strategies and styles. What was your
yeah.
main observation then? What's a main difference that you've perceived or a similarity across the schools?
I find it very different is that because in Hong Kong, when I study martial art here, the approach was not very systematic. So it was more like a teacher-disciple relationship with, we show great respect to our martial art instructor, but we often call that Sifu. But, in the UK, we still call, the instructor Sifu, but the relationship is very different. We treat him more like a friend, and his teaching approach is also very step by step and very clear. So I think I see how martial arts can be taught to different kinds of people, not just to Hong Kong people in Hong Kong. So yeah, I think that system seems to be more effective towards that the global kind of martial art practitioner. Yeah.
Oh, which one? The kind of British, the systematic approach
Yeah,
is
yes, the systematic approach in the British, in the UK's system. Yeah.
okay. Oh, is that because I guess in Hong Kong there's an older and more sort of organic tradition of of learning martial arts, whereas in Britain
Mm,
maybe was more systematized, more institutional. So like you wanted to open a club, you open it in a sports center or in a community center,
mm.
whereas maybe in Hong Kong it's part of people's lives in different ways, and it's maybe in their house or in their studio. Is that a difference maybe?
Yeah, I guess so because in Hong Kong, it usually it's in those old buildings, especially in Kowloon, and usually those building or those flats, they were passed down by the family of the instructor. So it's usually quite small, and that's maybe one of the reasons the style of teaching is quite different because they are not some of the teachers they may not be aiming at having more students, so they just want to pass on their arts and also the oral tradition as well because many of them are quite old and they may not want to, or they don't know how to develop a systematic approach to pass on their martial arts.
I guess it's something. I mean, I've taught when I've. It might not just be. It might not be a China or Hong Kong British difference. It might just be a difference of context. So, like, if I'm teaching a class and it's in a community center, when I'm going along there, I'm thinking, okay, so we've done this, we need to do this, and it's a group, and it's formal, and it starts at this time, and it ends at this time. But if someone comes around to my house to learn something, some Tai Chi, some push hands or something like that, you just kind of go, oh, do you fancy learning this? And what about this? And I'll show you this thing. And it's like no structure. There might be a vague sense of structure. There's no syllabus. It's just like, have you done this? Or have you ever, it might just be something like that, maybe.
Yeah, because there are some like really old masters in Hong Kong. They, when they are in the gym or in the studio or at their home, sometimes they won't teach by themselves. So they would, ask the senior students to give instructions, and then they would, observe from behind, and maybe they are, reading newspaper at the same time. So, so just find out, when should be the right time to intervene.
Yeah. Okay. And so, I mean, we can talk more about martial arts, but what about well, in terms of film studies, because you've done a lot of work on different aspects of film. What was the place of film studies in your PhD? What was the kind of title or the focus of it?
So my focus was on, film aesthetics. So especially cinematic representation of martial arts in Chinese martial art films. So I focus on the hand-to-hand combat tradition, which is known as Kung Fu tradition. So we look at, films such as, Bruce Lee's films, or before Bruce Lee, we have the Wong Fei-hung film, the original Wong Fei-hung, not the Jet Li one in the 90s, but I will also talk about more recent, like, the Yip Man film. So this hand-to-hand combat tradition was like criticized by many film scholars as, a vulgar tradition in a sense that, because they focus on, violence and, visual excitement. But I was trying to figure out a new way of looking at these Kung Fu films, so that, I want to connect this tradition with, Chinese philosophy and Chinese aesthetic, especially. So that was my thesis.
Yeah, and so you've written about that. You published in a martial arts studies journal, didn't you? And you talked about the whole kind of Wen and Wu aspect to kind of the intellectual and the physical sides of it. I mean, how would you explain this to someone, let's say, who didn't know anything about the Chinese tradition or Chinese philosophy? Would you say that there's philosophy in it, or would you say that it's just a different realm? It's just cinematic and it's action or not action. How does it relate to different forms of maybe philosophy or culture in China and East Asia?
That's a very interesting question. So my first response, responding to your concepts of Wen and Wu. So Wen refers to the literary side of Chinese masculinity. So it's more like a scholarly attribute. And in Chinese culture, we also have another attribute, which is called the martial, the Wu dimension as well. So the Wen and Wu together, they form the most ideal Chinese masculinity. So I think that would be the cultural perspective of, understanding the place of martial art in traditional Chinese society. And of course, in different dynasties, there are different relationship between the Wen and Wu. So there were times where, Wen is placed higher than Wu, and sometimes Wu would be higher. So it really depends on the historical context. So I think the Wen and Wu concept would be the cultural understanding of martial arts in China. As to your question about the philosophy or aesthetics. So my proposition was that I want to find out, okay, so if we film a martial art performance on screen, and then how we can express, Chinese philosophies such as Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism through specific forms, or the cinematic medium, is it effective in, mediating that concept of, Chinese Buddhism or Confucianism, something like that. Okay, so I would like to try to bridge that gap between cinema and philosophy using, martial art performance.
Okay, I mean, there's a lot I would ask about that. I'm thinking when, as you're talking, I'm thinking about Ip Man. I'm thinking about the Ip Man films,
Mm,
and I'm thinking about the way in which, not just in Ip Man, but also in The Grandmaster, which is also about Ip Man, and uh, uh, the the character, the good guy, like the main guy, is always
mm,
very restrained and very dignified, and the opponents are
mm,
often huge and flailing and so there's it's like about a kind of self-control, isn't it, a kind of dignity. But
mm,
that's not just in a Chinese tradition. I mean, if you think about Western action
mm.
heroes, if you think about Jason Bourne, if
Yeah,
you think about James Bond, these are very
yeah.
restrained, dignified. Is that necessarily Confucian, or is it necessarily about being a kind of a Chinese gentleman? Is it, or is it maybe transcultural, or is it just a cinematic convention that the hero is in an action film is probably going to be more reserved? I don't know. What do you think? A lot of stuff there, but what do you think?
Okay, so my first response is if we look at it from the Asian perspective. So if we look at like kung fu or wuxia, swordsmen, swordswomen, or as you said, the Yip Man tradition. So we can go back to Kwang Heng's and Wong Fei Hong films. But we can also take a look at Japanese tradition, like the samurai films, the Kurosawa's film, like Yojimbo. So they all have that calm presence. And of course, if you take a look at it from the Confucian perspective, that humble attribute, I think, is one of the key aspects of Confucian humaneness. So that would actually connect to the form of there are some substance form. One of them is called Hongga. So they stress the lower body. So the lower body is also one of the ways to understand how we can take forces. So my approach was that when you face intense conflict coming up, then you shake. But if you can slow down your body, and you can lower your balance, then you can take harder forces. So I will connect this. So in my thesis, I connect this with the Confucian idea of centeredness. So you place your center balance lower, so that you can take forces. So I think that's one of the ways to deal with it. But your comment about whether action hero itself is um, more or less calm, I think it really depends. So if you look at like Bruce Lee, he may not be calm sometimes,
No.
so he can also have his very emotional moment.
Mhm.
But if you also look at other genre like Rambo, he is not very calm either. So I guess it depends on the particular kind of action genre. So if you talk about martial art films, I think the hero more or less is has a calmer presence. But if you talk about Hollywood action in general, so it depends on what kind of So
So-
Sean, I would say.
yeah. So okay. So it can be. It's a type of physicality that can be connected both
Mm,
with possibly a something that you might call a philosophy or a culture, but also it's a cinematic convention, because it's so well. There's so many different ways of of talking about this, because my thought process is being really confused by thinking about Cobra Kai, and I'm trying to work out the Netflix remake, or the follow-on of the Karate Kid, and that's all about. It's always about gaining and losing balance. So in the first Karate Kid, um, Danny LaRusso has to do that kick, but he has to be incredibly calm to do it. And also in the 2010 remake, where Jaden Smith has to do that preposterous,
mm,
impossible kick, and it has to be a
mm,
mental. Like, you have to learn that calmness. You have to learn that control, don't you? I mean, the Cobra Kai really
yeah.
messes with that, and people are learning and losing and becoming chaotic and becoming disorganized. Okay, very interesting. Very, very interesting. There's so much to go with that. Um, so tell us more about the aesthetics. Is it with the either, because there's sometimes a distinction there between the sort of wuxia tradition and the kung fu tradition of Bruce Lee. There's the more
mm,
crouching tiger, hidden dragon tradition, and then
mm,
there's the Bruce Lee
mm.
fists and anger and passion. Um, are those aesthetics now becoming more transnational? Are we seeing them incorporated into more Western films too, or is it still something uniquely Chinese and Hong Kong?
That's a very interesting question that I was trying to figure out the connection between, the more calm and tranquil understanding of martial arts. So one of the keyword I used was tranquility, because in the past, when film study focused so a lot on authenticity and expressivity. So you mentioned Bruce Lee, the passion, but
Mm.
not many scholars talk about tranquility. So I think this tranquility aspect is one of the key dimension in kung fu and wuxia film. And I think in the early 2000 or around the millennium, lots of Hong Kong filmmakers they sought opportunities in Hollywood or in Europe, working with different filmmakers on action films. So I think that global kind of like flow of martial art talents brought about that movement in aesthetics. So when we look at films such as The Matrix,
Mm.
so we have lots of kung fu elements in it, and also aesthetically speaking, it plays quite a lot of emphasis on tranquility as well. Especially if we take a look at the end, the final fight scene between Keanu Reeves and Hugo Weaving, then we can find that calmness. And after The Matrix, we can also find that trace in some of Keanu Reeves' films. Uh, he made that the Man of Tai Chi, I guess. So I think that film also expressed that kindness a bit a lot. So we can see such connection if we trace the production team or specific actors or directors who work with Hong Kong talent before. Then we can find that aesthetic characteristics. Maybe in recent example would be John Wick series, because John Wick series the production team worked in The Matrix as well as in Man of Tai Chi as well.
Yeah.
So you can see quite a lot of similar aesthetics in John Wick, but of course there are like some differences. So I can elaborate a little more if you want to know more. Yeah, thank you.
Well, I mean, I think that's absolutely fascinating. But I want to, I guess, connect this back to martial arts practice as well, because
Yeah.
I was thinking about this, and I'm thinking about calmness, and we're thinking about the convention in these films where you're going to win if you're calm, or you're not going to be ruffled and destroyed psychologically. And how does that square with your experience of say, sparring or fighting? Because in some senses, it's true. You might be against a tougher opponent, a better opponent, stronger, faster, etc. But
Mm,
if you're totally in the zone, that's not,
mm,
it's not a bad place to be. It's when you're totally like busy in the head going, oh my god, I hope I don't get hurt here. Then it's a terrible place to be. So is it just a film convention, or is it something that has in some way seeped out from the wisdom of fighting, or has it been fed back into the wisdom of fighting, or what do you think? Just speculate. What do you think?
I think because I think if I see it from the Hong Kong perspective, lots of filmmakers in Hong Kong who make martial arts films, they are practitioners. So I think they would bring this dimension into their filmmakings. So I think, as Bruce Lee himself also said, that you need to remain calm when you're fighting, and getting too tense is not a good thing. So yeah, I do think that martial arts, cinematic representation of martial arts should connect with real martial art practice, and that calmness is one of the key ways to make that connection. Um, so I totally agree with you. So yeah, this is a very important dimension, I think, aesthetically. So how we can manifest that calmness using film language is one of my concern in my thesis. So maybe you can use static camera, use centerness, or you can use a flashback. So to think about your training in the past and how that training in an empty room can help you beat the opponent now. So I think that that also very interesting to see how different ways you can manifest that calmness through editing.
Yes, through editing, absolutely. And I'm thinking obviously of the final scene in one of the Ip Man films, I think, where he's just flashbacks to his wooden dummy training,
Yeah.
and he's actually just beating hell out of somebody who's essentially out on his feet like that. He's boom, boom, smash, bang.
Yeah.
But it's tranquility. He's just going through the training
Yeah.
motions on the dummy.
Yeah.
So let's talk about say film studies. Is, in your experience, having researched across the scholarship around martial arts films and action films, is there an East-West divide? Is there a difference in the way that, I mean, I don't know if you read, like, say, maybe Chinese language scholarship. I don't read Chinese language scholarship, but even in the English language scholarship, is there a difference between the way that it's written about in say Hong Kong and Chinese universities as opposed to like maybe American and British university scholarship? What do you think?
Mm, yeah, that's a very academic question. So I think one of the ways to approach this is to see it from, the Euro-American film theory. Like, they would, maybe when I was in King's, they have a film studies department. So they would place the emphasis more on the Euro-American side. So maybe we would take a look at, realism. Say, for example, like Bazan and, how Kung Fu or the authenticity of Kung Fu relate to realism and how that would, mean for Chinese film theory. So I think Chinese film theory is one area that is not, of course, there has a lot been developed in the past 2 decades, but in terms of Kung Fu cinema, it's still a lot to be said about this field. So that's why I think um, there are quite a lot of Chinese film study material written I think, since the Republican era, but lots of them are not yet translated by film scholars. Not to mention that it has been applied in the study of martial cinema. So I think, I really am excited about this task of translating Chinese film theory and how I can make a connection between Chinese side of looking at things with the Euro-American side. So that's one of my objective after I finish my PhD. Yeah.
Oh, so that's a project that you're going to be undertaking, is it, to do some more translations and kind of writing about the differences in approaches? I see.
Yeah, I think because
Well,
that's right.
would you say that there is a distinct kind of Chinese film theory tradition that is very, very different from the Euro-American tradition?
That's very interesting. So we look at what is real quite differently. So we would, say, for example, we look at the concept of emotion or, affect. So we would look at the idea of, in Chinese, we call that qing, but qing has different layers of meaning, just like, we have emotion, we have affect. So I watched the podcast when you talk about affect as well. So I really was inspired by that. So I think, yes, on the one hand, we can make that critical intervention on how to understand affect from a Chinese perspective, but we also need to avoid the trap of essentialism. So I'm still figuring out the best way to do it without, falling the trap into, essentialism. Yeah.
Okay. Essentialism it's a really difficult thing to navigate, isn't it? I tend to think about things in terms of, because you don't want to essentialize the difference between East and West, but
Yeah.
it sometimes you can look at a context and go, yeah, but that is so different, and people are thinking in such a specific way that, but it's not really about any kind of essence. It's more about a kind of weight or a gravity, a density to certain traditions, isn't it? It's, rather than like, this is essentially Chinese, it's like, but for a long history, this has been, these are the institutions and these are the values and these are the connections that people make. And that's how I tend to try and like unpick something that looks like an essence. It's not an essence, really.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm totally aware of the tendency of you not to use the word essence in the podcast.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's a crime. It's a crime. You can't propose an essence. I don't know if there are essences to things, and I do wonder and worry about essences because, I mean, even in martial arts practice, and you find that you might combine. I'll take something from one aspect of training, like I might try and use a sort of Tai Chi like approach if I'm doing eskrima or boxing, and I might want to
Mm,
incorporate some yoga into qigong, and it's like, what am I doing here? Like, what is the effect of this? What am I losing everything, or is there a reason why I can't combine these different techniques from different traditions? And it kind of bothers me all the time, like about what I'm doing with the essence of something.
yeah. So yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. So that's why in my framework, when we talk about the connection between the Euro-American understanding of cinematic martial arts, so I use that as the basis for me to build on my idea of tranquility, because tranquility cannot be out of nowhere. So you need to, as a filmmaker, so if you want to present that tranquility, it is necessary to go through the process of expressing authenticity first. You need to show the martial arts, you need to make it believable, or
Right.
in some way, because like even in martial arts films, you have kung fu film, but if you think about Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, so it is real in that universe, so you have to make it believable in the narrative. But
Yeah,
on the other hand, you also need to make it expressive.
yeah,
But the degree of that expressivity can be varied. And finally, how that tranquility can be represented. That's one of my research questions. Yeah. So
yeah.
yeah.
So I'm thinking about tranquility, and I'm thinking about cinematic depictions of it. And the thing that leaps to my mind is the Last Samurai. So in the Last
Mm,
Samurai, I mean, this is a film that people hate, the Last Samurai. Um, with Tom
yeah.
Cruise, Tom Cruise as
Yeah.
the disenfranchised and kind of ruined American who goes east, and he learns to meditate, and he learns like kendo or kenjutsu or something like this, and and then eventually he becomes like the last samurai. But in that film, we do see some quite good depictions of like that kind of like no mind, that kind of. I mean, what do you
Mm,
think about that? So that's a Hollywood film made in a Japanese context, and it's attempting to communicate something. But now, is that an Orientalist understanding of tranquility? I mean, yes, but is it worse than a Chinese or Hong Kong depiction of martial tranquility, in your opinion?
mm, I wouldn't say that is it is a bad thing, because I think it's at least an attempt to make that cultural dialogue between the different understanding of Asian or martial art aesthetics. So I think that's a really good thing to do, because we want to promote different ways of representing martial arts, especially in action films. So we don't just want Michael Bay style or Rambo style. So we want something different. And on the other hand, I think that um, I think you're right that Hollywood, maybe they prefer uh, a Buddhist, or the Zen way of understanding martial arts quite a lot. Maybe starting from the 60s, 70s. So they place quite a lot of emphasis in the Zen Buddhism, and but the difference, I would say, in the Asian context would be, apart from the Zen Buddhist tradition, we still have the Taoist tradition, we still have the Confucian tradition as well. So I think Chinese martial art films, they sort of like combine different schools of Chinese or Asian philosophy more than the Hollywood understanding, in a way.
Okay, so that.
And
Yep.
yeah.
No, you go.
Yeah, I think there's one more point. Yeah, I think there's one more point is about the the archival aspect of martial arts, because in Asian context they would tend to feature a specific form of martial arts.
Mm-hmm.
So I think they would, make that connection between the martial arts form and the philosophy behind it, or the connection to tranquility through the form. That aspect would be more prominent when compared to the Hollywood approach of, aesthetics featuring martial arts. Yeah.
Okay, so the filmmakers then are very literate in terms of martial styles, but
Mm,
what about in terms of audiences? Do you think that a Chinese or Hong Kong or East Asian audience is more literate in the martial styles? So, for instance, if you watch a film like The Grandmaster, and it's all about
mm,
styles, isn't it? And it's very, very clearly about styles, but also there've been certain, like, Jet Li films and so on, where it's all about the interplay of different styles and different logics of fighting, much of which
mm-hmm,
is all of which is lost on non-martial artists. So who is that
mm.
literacy for? Is it for a Chinese audience, or is it for an aficionado audience, or is it for the directors and choreographers themselves? I mean, why, who is it for? What's it doing?
Mm, okay, so okay, so we need to maybe think about who was the investor. So if we think about the investor was from people who have connection with certain martial arts school or martial style, which is quite the case in Hong Kong. There are some businessmen whose kung fu master he respect a lot, so he wants to spend a huge amount of money and make a film about that master. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that would make that connection quite easily.
Mm-hmm.
And it also depends on the period of time, because I agree with you that these days the audience, they can't tell which style is which, because everything it's so mixed up now. But in the past, like say Hong Kong in the 60s or 70s or even earlier 50s, because lots of people in Hong Kong, they practice martial arts.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe they have people who work in that film as well. So I think in that period, the people, the audience, they would learn martial art, or they would comment on the style on screen quite a lot. So I think in that period of time, Hong Kong, that literacy would be very important. Yeah, so I think nowadays, what's that for? I think sometimes I would say, especially for the Yip Man film, so I think that would help passing on the tradition of Wing Chun, because in the past Hong Kong, they focus quite a lot on the Hong Ga style.
Mm-hmm.
So they make a lot of film about Hong Gas, but the Yip Man film throughout the 70s to 90s, only one or two films about Wing Chun. So
Mm-hmm.
one of them by Michelle Yeoh, but it's not until late 2000s when Donnie Yen started making Yip Man film, then a whole lot of Yip Man film came out. So I think it's also about the struggle between different Southern Chinese martial art styles in Hong Kong in the cinematic realm. Yeah.
So why do you think that there was such an explosion of interest in Yip Man at that time? So it was like, was it 2008, 2009? It started to be
Mm,
made and released, and
yeah.
there were so many different films that came out really quite quickly. I mean, do you
Mm.
think there was I mean, I have my theories, but do you have a specific theory about why Yip Man, why Wing Chun at that time?
Okay, I think one of the reasons was that if we take a look at it from the economic or financial perspective, was that Hong Kong after 2003 has the CEPA program. So when they encourage filmmakers to work with China and then have co-production. So I think that platform allowed lots of filmmakers to work on topics that can be filmed and can be also screened in the large Chinese market. So I think Kung Fu is one of the genres that you can get past the censorship quite easily, because it deals with the idea of Chineseness. And I think that's one of the key reasons why kung fu film got so popular, and also lots of people want to share that profit. So that's one of the reasons from the financial and economic perspective. But I personally also think that it's from a cultural perspective. I also think that it's a way for Hong Kong filmmakers to assert a voice, because I think Yip Man uh, is a Hong Kong person, and also it's a story about Bruce Lee's master. So I think it has a deep connection to Hong Kong. So in the context where Hong Kong filmmakers got their voice kind of like diminished in the co-production platform. So why not we take advantage of this opportunity to say some stories about Hong Kong, so that let more people know about this city, and also the story, the history of this city. Of course, there are lots of things got changed in the Yuan film, and you don't recognize Hong Kong as Hong Kong in the Yuan film. And also politically speaking, is quite different from the historical fact. So, but I think there are different versions of Yip Man. So if you look at the Herman Yau's Yip Man in 2010, so that is more grounded in Hong Kong, like in terms of story, and also lots of other aspects as well. Yeah.
Okay, and so I mean I don't want to touch on any controversial subjects, but do you think that given the issues around Hong Kong identity and Hong Kong, who controls Hong Kong and so on, do you think that we're going to see, or are we already seeing the use of martial arts in films to contribute to that discussion, to assert a Hong Kong identity, or to try and do something to show the world, something important about Hong Kong? Or do you think that's likely? Because in terms of censorship and in terms of what's allowed, things have to be quite metaphorical, don't they? But also not clearly metaphorical, I guess. It can't be too transparent, can it? If people want to protest about power and control and maybe democracy or freedom, do you think there might be? Do you think it'll stick with Ip Man, or do you think that we'll, Ip Man is finished? Is it a different figure we need now? Maybe Bruce Lee again. Let's just talk about Bruce Lee again.
I think, everyone connected to Bruce Lee has already been, dealt with, basically. So we recycle Bruce Lee in the 70s, 80s, and then now recycle Yip Man. We have so many Yip Man now, and even everyone connected to Yip Man, they have like side stories as well. So I think yes and no, but I think there are also some attempts to contain Yip Man under the the grand narrative of Tai Chi. So if you look at Jack Ma's short martial art film called Gong Shou Dao, right? So he starred himself as a martial artist. So the founder of Alibaba, right? So he cast himself as a martial artist, and he played Tai Chi, and he actually beat Yip Man at the end. So that has a lot of meaning. So what does that mean? And how the relationship between the northern China and southern China got played out in that short clip. So I think it's very interesting to see the struggle metaphorically, and also how Hong Kong use martial art as a sticking hand with different it's very difficult to pinpoint, yes, but that's it. So the idea of
Yeah. Okay, well, so what does the future hold for you? Have you got any publications lined up? You've got a job at the moment, and I hope it's a long term or a permanent or a good job. In terms of publications, when will we be seeing more of your work in the English language that we can have access to?
So I'm currently submitted an article about the connection between Hong Kong martial cinema and Hollywood action, recent Hollywood actions. So I focus on the John Wick series. So how the idea of tranquility can be manifested in the brutal action of John Wick franchise. So lots of people think John Wick is a reckless person, but I see otherwise. So I see how they use the environment, the setting
Mm.
of the fight scenes to express that tranquility. So how that space can be, understood as a Hollywood's intervention to Hong Kong martial art aesthetic. So I think that's not restricted to the John Wick franchise, but also take a look at Black Panther and also the superhero films and how that motif can also be used by different genres as well.
Mm.
So that's what I'm currently doing. So hopefully I can turn my thesis into a book,
Mm.
so I can use let more people know about this concept of tranquility and to review the Kung Fu and Wuxia films in the past to see it from a different angle. Yeah.
I mean, when you just one last thing on tranquility, because when you're talking about John Wick and that character, he reminds me of a little bit of Odesu from Old Boy, who is just
Mm-hmm.
like there's a tranquility to his it's a kind of vengeance, it's a kind of anger, and those films. That film is about revenge, isn't it? But and John Wick is motivated by a kind of revenge, but in executing that, it's a kind of tranquility. And now I'm thinking also of Forrest Whitaker in Ghost Dog. There's a kind of like, this is what I'm doing, and it's a single-minded. There's no confusion in the head. It's just I'm doing this, and that's a type of tranquility that's very different to a passive tranquility, isn't it? That kind of this is what I'm doing, and nothing will stop me. You will have to kill me because nothing will stop me.
Mm-hmm.
There's two resonances to tranquility there. There's the hippie sitting meditating. There's a passivity there
Mm-hmm.
maybe. I don't know. But these are some of the thoughts that occur to me.
Yeah, yeah. So I really like the examples that you just gave. So I think yes, it corresponds to different kind of tranquility, and also if you have watched the latest Avengers like Infinity War, so the Thanos was also a character about he wants to destroy humanity, and he has a very clear focus. So I think yes, and I would say, if you look at John Wick at the end, he got his finger like, disembodied. And I think the character grow a little bit in the narrative. So from the first John Wick to the third one, so you can see his growth and his changing perception about, revenge. So he does not rely on, revenge anymore at the end, I think. So he changed his perspective, and that would also give a new insight about tranquility. So I think we should pay attention to the character growth in the narrative. So I think they're learning at the same time. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I don't know if you heard the thing go bing on my computer, but that's an alert that tells me that our time is is drawing to a close. But Wayne, it's been lovely to talk to you again. Thank you so much for taking the
Thank
time
you.
to talk to me. Thank you.